Welcome back to this conversation. We are going to be making a case for homosexuality in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And specifically, we are going to jump into part two and talk about what the sources say. We're going to look first at what we see in the scriptures, and then second, what we see in the words of modern prophets and apostles. To start off, I wanted to get an understanding of the scriptures. So if we look at how many verses there are in the scriptures, there's just under 42,000. As you can see here, I have the different books listed with how many verses are in each. Between all of them, there's about 42,000 verses. And so I was curious, how many times has homosexuality been directly mentioned in all of these verses? If you had to guess a number, what would you guess? If we look at the scriptures, we see it's only been directly mentioned 7 times. So 7 out of 42,000 verses. If homosexuality is as big of an issue as it seems to be, why isn't it touched on more in the scriptures? And specifically, I was curious and I made a list of everything that Jesus himself had to say on the matter. So here is a slide that has all of Jesus's words regarding homosexuality. Okay. I feel like we could almost end the presentation there. If Jesus didn't say anything about homosexuality, then why do we feel justified making conclusions about it? What's interesting is that in the time of Jesus, he actually most likely had an experience where if he was opposed to homosexuality, he could have condemned it. In Luke 7, there's a story where there's a centurion who's like a Roman official, and he has this servant who is very dear to him who is dying. And so the centurion sends other servants to Jesus to ask that Jesus heals the servant. And so Jesus says, all right, you got this. And so then in verse 9, he basically hears from the centurion and he says, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And he heals the servant. And so then the servants that went to Jesus go back, and then they find that the servant had been healed. Historian wrote, there is an unmistakable same-sex subtext to this story. The servant for whom the centurion pleads is more than just an ordinary servant. One would not expect a Roman centurion to intercede, let alone beg, on behalf of a mere cook or housekeeper, which makes sense, right? If the servant is working a role that's replaceable, then if the servant dies, it's not that big of a deal. But the writer continues, rather, the relationship between a centurion and his favored servant is assumed to be a romantic one. The centurion servant is a pace, which is a Greek word meaning a boy companion, and not a doulos, which is a Greek word meaning a mere slave. It was a common practice for Roman centurions to have younger male servants who acted as concubines as well. So in this story, we don't know for sure, but it seems likely, considering the context, that this Roman centurion had an intimate, romantic, sexual relationship with this servant. And because this relationship was so close, the centurion pleaded with Jesus to heal the servant. And not only did Jesus heal the servant, but he commented on the centurion's faith and said, I haven't seen so great faith in all of Israel. So if Jesus did have strong opinions about homosexuality, this most likely would have been the perfect place to address them. But since we don't have anything from Jesus, we have to look at what the actual verses themselves say that do address homosexuality. What's interesting is that from the 7 verses, all of them are located in the Bible. If we look in the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, homosexuality is never mentioned. What's really interesting there is we consider the Book of Mormon to be the fullness of the gospel and to be the most true of any book, but not once does it directly mention homosexuality. And so that's kind of interesting to think about. We're going to take a look at each of these individually and see what they can teach us about God's opinion on homosexuality and whether or not he actually condemns them. First off, we're going to talk about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This story is really important because historically, this story has been used to condemn homosexuality more than anything else. You'll remember during the historical context that the word sodomy came from the word Sodom and Gomorrah, and sodomy was eventually used specifically to condemn same-sex relationships between men. So this is really important for us to stand. So we're going to spend more time here than the other verses and see what we can glean. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, there are 2 angels who come to the city Sodom, and then Lot meets them and brings them to his house. He basically helps them out. He makes them some nice dinner, and they're hanging out. And then in verse 4, it says, the men of the city compass the house round about. And then it says, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. So Lot's in his house with these angels, and there's a Taylor Swift concert happening outside. And they call into Lot and they say, "Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Know in this context is used in a sexual way. And so then Lot goes to the door and says, "Hey, do we really have to do this?" And so then he says, "I have these two daughters. I can send them out to you if you want to do whatever you want with them, but don't do anything to these men or these angels, which are with me right now." And so then basically they threaten him, and then he's able to escape and get away, and it all works out. Before we dive into this story and talk about more specifics, I just wanted to include the rest of what happens in this chapter to emphasize that we can't look at this story with a modern lens because beliefs were so different back then. In the rest of this story, Lot takes his two daughters up into a mountain, and then while they're there, the two daughters say, "Hey, our dad is old. There's no other man around us. How are we going to have babies?" And they were like, "Well, dad's a man." And so they decide to get him drunk, and then they sleep with him, and then they have children. And so their dad is also the dad of their kids. So I say that just to emphasize before we even start that times were different back then, and we can't allow our modern perspective to influence how we see things. So with that, there are some initial observations and questions that I want us to think about. The first is that verse 4 mentions that all the people from every quarter were gathered around Lot's house. And so even though there were men who said that they wanted to know the two angels, we also see that all the people were there. And so we don't know if only the men were involved in this. If all the people were there, then this seems like a citywide thing and not specifically just the men. Additionally, Lot had been there for some time, and so why had the men never tried to have sex with Lot or rape Lot if he had been there for a while? The last question is, why would Lot offer his daughters to these people if he believed the men were homosexual? If he's been there for a time, then he would know the preferences of the men. He would be familiar with the culture. So if he thought that his daughters would be a sufficient substitute, then that must give some kind of, like some kind of hint about what these men were actually doing or what they wanted. If we look at the context, we understand that during these times, hospitality was a core value. Throughout the Bible, we see this come up a lot. In Luke 7, it says, "I entered your house, you gave me no water for my feet." Hebrews 13 says, "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers." And Romans 12 says that Christians should be given to hospitality. Specifically, this is important. We see Jesus talk about it in Matthew 10. And he says, "Whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when ye depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." Jesus is saying, if people are not hospitable towards you, then they'll face the same condemnation as Sodom and Gomorrah. If Jesus understood the story of Sodom and Gomorrah to be about homosexuality, why did he compare it to hospitality here? That wouldn't make sense. Along similar lines, in Joshua 6, we see a story where the city of Jericho, just like Sodom, was completely destroyed by the Lord. But the one person who was spared was a prostitute, even though prostitution is prohibited in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And she was spared because she offered hospitality to the messengers of Joshua. So even though we condemn prostitution, even though we consider that a pretty grave sin, that was less important than her extending hospitality to messengers of the Lord. Her offering of hospitality trumped any sin that she had committed. So we have to understand that hospitality is a core value. And so that's actually what is the problem here, is that the men in Sodom and really the people in general weren't hospitable towards these two men or angels who came into the city, and that's why it was destroyed. We see this considering the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in relation to the chapters around it. The story of Sodom is in a section of the Bible where hospitality and ethics are central themes. Only one chapter earlier, Abraham had welcomed 3 men to his tent, and the text spends 5 verses on the details of the menu he prepares. And right after the story of Sodom comes yet another story of hospitality, this time of Abraham and Sarah's visit to Gerar. These chapters of Genesis are variations of hospitality. First, Abraham and Lot's generosity. Second, the wickedness of Sodom. And third, Abraham's fear of the king of Gerar. So, as one writer put it, reading the story of Sodom as being about homosexuality is like reading the story of an axe murderer as being about an axe. If you're still unsure about this, let's see what other biblical writers have said in regards to Sodom and Gomorrah. Isaiah specifically castigated Judah as a sinful nation and compared it to the rules of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah. But the sins that Isaiah highlighted were not of a sexual nature. They were sins of oppressing marginalized groups, murder, and theft. Isaiah later prophesied that the pride and glory of the Babylonians will be overthrown by God, like Sodom and Gomorrah. If Sodom and Gomorrah were interpreted during biblical times to be condemning homosexuality, then why would Isaiah relate that story to sins that have nothing to do with it? We see this in other places as well. Jeremiah declared that the adultery, idolatry, and power abuses of false prophets rendered them all like Sodom. After Jerusalem's fall to Babylonia, the writer of Lamentations said that the punishment of my people is greater than that of Sodom. Amos and Zephaniah too invoke Sodom to describe God's judgment on those who oppress the poor or exhibit prideful and mocking behavior. Throughout the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah is regularly used to condemn sin, but never committed, faithful relationships between people of the same sex. In Ezekiel 16, he actually clarifies specifically what the iniquity was of Sodom. He says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy, and they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good." So the sins that are listed here are pride, idleness, not reaching out to the poor and needy. They were haughty and they committed abomination. This word abomination, if you click on it and look at the footnote, it says homosexual behavior. But as we're going to look at in a minute, that word abomination actually comes from a word that most likely did not actually mean homosexual behavior. We're going to get to that in a minute. But notice that even if it does, that is only one of the sins, and that there are several others there as well. So it's interesting that Sodom and Gomorrah is used specifically to condemn homosexuality when biblical prophets really never describe that as being the case. Here's a modern day example to kind of illustrate the point. In the late 1900s, there was a man by the name of Abner Louima, and this is kind of a tragic and horrible story. But Abner went to a club in New York City, and then afterwards he got arrested. And then while he was in jail, there was a police officer who sodomized and raped Abner using the handle of a toilet plunger. Now, we would look at this story and we wouldn't say that the police officer raped Abner because there was a committed and faithful relationship there. We wouldn't say that there was love. There wasn't say that there was fidelity. We would say that the police officer raped Abner to demonstrate power, control, and dominance. And sex just happened to be the means by which he did that. It's the same kind of thing with Sodom and Gomorrah. There are sins that are being condemned here, but sex between men is just the medium by which the men performed it, if that makes sense. It's not necessarily about the act itself, it's about why the sins were being committed. Additionally, we see a similar story to Sodom and Gomorrah, but this story is never used to condemn homosexuality. In Judges 19, there's a similar story where there's a man who lives in the city of Gibeah, and he has another man who comes and is staying with him. And while he's there, the people in the city say, "Hey, bring forth this foreigner that we can know him." You see that in verse 22. And so the man who lives there says, "Don't do this. Here's my daughter." And then the man's concubine, "Do whatever you want with them." But the men don't listen. And so they send out the concubine, and basically the people rape her until she dies. And so then the men get really upset. And as a result, they cut the concubine's body into 12 pieces and then send it out to all of their friends so that they can see what has happened and they can get upset and help them out. We like posting on social media when we get really upset, and I guess this was the way of doing it then. Who needs Instagram when you can send people a femur? Am I right? So we have this story where the men wanted to, in verse 22, as we see, that they may know the man who was the foreigner. And so the man sends out his concubine and they rape her. And so this story isn't used to condemn homosexuality because they say, "Oh, the men had sex with a concubine, so obviously they're not homosexuals as we would understand." But the story starts the exact same way as Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the fact that they rape her is basically just emphasizing that this is about power, dominance, and control. And Sodom and Gomorrah was the same thing, where it wasn't about loving, committed relationships between two people of the same sex. This was about people using sex to make another person humiliated or look bad. It was about hospitality. If you're still not convinced, then here's a quote from Joseph Smith. In that second paragraph, he said, In consequence of rejecting the gospel of Jesus Christ and the prophets who God hath sent, the judgments of God have rested upon people, cities, and nations in various ages of the world, which was the case with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah that were destroyed for rejecting the prophets. If after everything we've talked about, you're still unsure, this quote from Joseph Smith is hard to refute, that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for rejecting the prophets. Never is homosexuality mentioned either by Joseph Smith or by the biblical prophets themselves. So why did this change? In the first century, we had a philosopher named Philo. He was from Egypt. And during the same time as the Epistle of Barnabas, it's actually possible that Philo read the Epistle of Barnabas and he came to this conclusion afterwards. So, another example of Barnabas's misinterpretation of the law of Moses leading to other misinterpretations of biblical texts. But he wrote that not only in their mad lust for women did they violate the marriages of their neighbors, but also men mounted males without respect for the sex nature. This was specifically in regards to Sodom and Gomorrah. In general, if we look during this time period, there wasn't very much that was written about Sodom and Gomorrah condemning same-sex relationships. There was a writer in the 2nd century who never discussed it. In the 3rd century, there was another writer who said that basically Lot escaped the punishment because he opened his house to strangers. Angels entered the hospital house and fire entered the houses closed to strangers. So that was interpreted to be hospitality. Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed because they were inhospitable. And then in the 4th century, we have the writer St. Jerome, who used Sodom and Gomorrah to condemn pride and gluttony. However, during the 4th century, if you remember during the historical context, that during this time, this is when legislation started to come forth to condemn homosexuality. This is when the Epistle of Barnabas had spread, and it's been 200 years later, and other writers have started to build on it too. And one writer said, the men of that time had a passion for boys, and on that account they suffered this punishment. Another writer said, out of luxury grew such disgraceful passions that men rushed upon men committing base acts. And then finally, in the 5th century, when the death penalty is enacted, Augustine wrote that males burn towards males with hideous lust. So by the start of the 5th century, same-sex behavior had replaced inhospitality as the dominant understanding of the sin that brought God's judgment on Sodom. So even though the text itself doesn't seem to condemn homosexuality, even though biblical writers never seem to condemn it, and even though Joseph Smith himself said that Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't destroyed for homosexuality, that came to be the basic understanding because of a few people's opinions. The next verses we're going to talk about, I've grouped these together because they're very similar, are in Leviticus. So we have Leviticus 18:22, which says, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. And then we have Leviticus 20:13, which says, if a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death, and their blood shall be upon them. So we're going to talk about this, and understanding this word abomination is going to help us a lot to understand what is really going on here. Before we jump into any of that, some questions and context to help us out. The first is, why does this verse only address men? If these verses are being used to condemn homosexuality, then wouldn't that refer to any same-sex relationships, whether men or women? If it's only addressing men, then it must be referring to something different than our understanding of homosexuality, or it must be referring to something that's different from two people of the same gender who love and care about each other and want to enter a relationship. Additionally, it's important to understand the context of these chapters. At the beginning of Leviticus 18, it's talking about the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan and saying, hey, Israel, I need you to be different from these people. I need you to keep my ordinances and judgments and not do what they do. That's going to come into play here in a moment. If we look at that word abomination, it actually comes from the word tova, and the word tova was understood to be taboo. So modern day, we understand taboo to be something that's maybe different or unfamiliar, but not morally wrong. So, for example, women wearing pants used to be taboo. It wasn't that it was morally wrong, but it was just kind of weird or kind of unfamiliar. So a lot of times social conventions are thought to be matters of morality when they're not. So, for example, in some societies, people eat dogs or cats or snails or ants or grasshoppers. But just because it makes us uncomfortable or it's different to us doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. So what we're going to look at is that the word tova is used in these verses. And so whatever is being described here is taboo and not necessarily morally wrong. But we're going to look at lots of different things. So Leviticus 18 is part of a large section of the Torah that describes the boundaries between pure and impure, Israelite and Canaanite, proper and improper worship, and which follows upon the death of Aaron's sons following their offering of strange fire. So during these chapters, God is saying, okay, here's my people, here's what I want you to do. Everything else that's happening out there is outlawed. It's taboo. I don't want you doing those things. In Deuteronomy 23 and 1 Kings 14, it explains that Canaanites, the specific people that are being referenced here, had what's called Kadeshim, which stands for sacred prostitutes who were either male or female, who would enact the role of a god or goddess in an ecstatic sexual ritual. And campaigns against this prostitution was taken by both King Solomon and King Josiah. And these practices were found in Babylonia and in the ancient Near East. And so, if we look at these verses, it actually almost looks like God is condemning idolatry and cultic prostitution instead of loving and committed same sex relationships. One of the reasons that one of the things that help us come to this conclusion is that in the verse before, it says, "Thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Moloch, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." Moloch was a Canaanite god, and it wasn't an uncommon practice for parents to actually sacrifice their kids to this god. And so it's interesting that God is talking about this practice and saying this is condemned, and therefore man shall not lie with mankind as it is with womankind. It is taboo, or that is a practice that is happening outside of Israel, and it shouldn't be happening here. So it doesn't even necessarily seem like this is condemning homosexuality as we understand it, because it doesn't even address women. If we look at this word, it occurs 103 times in the Hebrew Bible and almost always has the connotation of a non-Israelite cultic practice. In Deuteronomy, there's a few places where that's mentioned. And it mentions a similar practice in verse 10 about making a son or daughter to pass through the fire, so child sacrifices, or like associating with enchanters or witches or charmers. All of these things are considered abominations, and they're all non-Israelite cultic practices. So it seems like that is actually what God is condemning here. Other places where Tova is used, the books of Kings and Chronicles use Tova 9 times to refer to acts that other nations committed in the land of Israel. Ezra uses the word in exactly the same way in a couple different places. In all these cases, Tova refers to foreign cultic behavior. Jeremiah associates Tova with idolatry and unspecified transgression. Malachi 2:11 uses the term to refer to the Israelites having married the daughter of a foreign god. And the prophet Ezekiel uses the term Tova, a record-setting 39 times, to refer to idolatry, usury, haughtiness, and pride, and heterosexual adultery and violence, as well as a general term for foreign acts or transgressions in a cultic context. And last but not least, in 5 instances, Ezekiel mentions Tova together with idolatry and lewdness, strongly suggesting that the nature of sexual Tova is not mere sexual activity, and certainly not loving intimate expression, but sexuality in a cultic context. It seems like that is actually what is being condemning here. If we look at this word taboo, and we understand it to mean something that is different but not morally wrong, and you were to say, okay, there's still that condemnation though. The reason why it was looked down upon, or why it was considered taboo, was because at this time women were considered less than men. That's the reason why law offered women to the mob. And the word virtue actually comes from the Latin word for male. So we see this showing up in a couple different places. In the 3rd century, Aristotle said the female is, as it were, a deformed male. I know these words are so harsh, right? Things are so different now. Philo said in the 1st century, he condemned same-sex relationships because one of the males suffers the affliction of being treated like women. Clement of Alexandria said passive men suffer the things of women, and we see other examples of this in the Bible. In Exodus 21, male slaves are to be freed after 6 years, whereas female slaves are never to be freed. In Deuteronomy 21, women can't inherit property if they have a living male sibling, and in Deuteronomy 22, men have the exclusive right to initiate divorce. So at this time, I wanted to mention this as well. At the time, adultery warranted the death penalty for women because women were considered property. And so adultery was basically a severe version of theft, where basically one woman is connecting with another man in a sexual way. And because of that, it's theft because the woman was considered property. So the reason why this was considered taboo, if it wasn't a cultic practice, then it was because women were considered as less than men. And so if two men have sex together, one of those men had to be considered a woman. And it would be wrong for a man to lower himself to the status of a woman. So if we believe that men and women are on equal standing, then this prohibition can no longer stand. If you're still not convinced, then it's important to understand that Jesus fulfilled the old law, and this restriction is listed as part of the old law. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Here are some of the other restrictions that are no longer in place because Jesus fulfilled the law. They are animal sacrifice, no pork or shellfish, menstruating women be put away for 7 days. The death penalty was enacted for adultery, disobedient children, and breaking the Sabbath. And there was a law that if you're a man and your brother passes away, you then have to marry his wife. So there are in Leviticus, in these verses, there are all of these prohibitions that are in place. And this specific tova or abomination is listed in these verses. And so if we believe that these practices are no longer condemned, why are we still condemning homosexuality when Jesus fulfilled that old law? As one writer put it, there are laws in the Old Testament that are not expressions of God's will for all time, but expressions of how best to manage sin in a particular people at a particular time. Next up, we have these verses in Romans 1, verses 26 and 27, and they say, "For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust toward one another, men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet." So this seems pretty cut and dry, right? It says, God gave them up to vile affections, for their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and the men had unnatural lust toward one another. So that seems pretty cut and dry. But if we dissect this, we see that it's actually quite a bit more complicated. For starters, I want to talk about this use of the word natural. In these verses, it says that the men had an unnatural lust towards each other. And maybe you've heard this before too, but I've regularly heard that homosexuality is condemned because it's unnatural. And so I wanted to look at what that actually means. And so if we look at the word natural, there's a few different definitions we can use. The first is the characteristic or essence of something. So, for example, the nature of love or human nature, and the opposite of that would be uncharacteristic. So, to do otherwise would be unnatural to him. So, something that is uncharacteristic. The second is the observable universe. So, for example, death is part of nature, or we have the laws of nature. And so, the opposite of that would be anything that is not scientifically observable, for example, ghosts or miracles. And last but not least is what would occur without human intervention. So these are like man-made elements that are not found in nature. So the opposite of that would be only characteristic of humans. So for example, air conditioning, glasses, or Cheese Whiz. I wish Cheese Whiz showed up in nature, but it doesn't. So we have this condemnation of homosexuality as being unnatural. And if we mean that, then we have to find out which one of these we're actually using. And so I think, from what I understand, most likely this first definition is the one where people are saying it's uncharacteristic of human nature to have two people of the same sex to be in a relationship with each other. But if we understand the historical context, we know that homosexuality has existed in some format through all cultures and all societies throughout all time. So saying it's against human nature doesn't necessarily stand. And if you talk to people who do experience same-sex attraction, it seems pretty natural to them. So if we say that homosexuality is unnatural, it doesn't seem to make sense considering what the word natural actually means and the definitions of them. So I think most likely when people say that homosexuality is unnatural, they say that it's unnatural because it doesn't lead to the continuation of the human race. So if two humans have sex together and it doesn't lead to procreation, then it must be unnatural. But if that's true, then that would mean that any same-sex relationships that don't lead to procreation must be unnatural as well. So for example, if we have infertile couples, is that unnatural? If someone chooses to stay celibate, is that unnatural because they're not continuing the human race? If you have people who never marry, is that unnatural? For example, Sherry Dew, who has never married and never had kids, is Sherry Dew unnatural because she hasn't had children? Or if we have married couples who have sex without the intent of having kids, would that be considered unnatural? These are questions that we really have to understand, because if we say homosexuality is unnatural, there really isn't much evidence behind that to support it. And if we look at nature, we actually see that homosexuality is present in over 1,500 different species. And so, if homosexuality is unnatural, then why does it occur in all of these different species and throughout humanity, throughout all of these different time periods and cultures? So, then my question would be, is homosexuality unnatural or unfamiliar? One reverend said, "From dogs to dolphins, same gender sexual attraction is a reality. What is natural for one individual may be a direct violation of another's nature. We, who God has created, have an obligation to live out as fully as possible the nature with which God has created us. To do otherwise is unhealthy and an insult to God." Patricia Holland, so Jeffrey R. Holland's wife, has a quote that I love and that I think goes along well. She said, "For many years, I tried to measure the oft-times quiet, reflective Pat Holland against the robust, bubbly, talkative, and energetic Jeff Holland and others with like qualities. I have learned through several fatiguing failures that you can't have joy being bubbly if you're not a bubbly person. I have given up seeing myself as a flawed person. Giving this up has freed me to embrace and rejoice in my own manner and personality." She continues saying, "My personality was created to fit precisely the mission and talents God gave me. I have found that I have untold, abundant sources of energy to be myself. But the moment I indulge in imitation of my neighbor, I feel fractured and fatigued and find myself forever swimming upstream. When we frustrate God's plan for us, we deprive this world and God's kingdom of our unique contributions, and a serious schism settles in our soul. God never gave us any task beyond our ability to accomplish it. We just have to be willing to do it our own way. We will always have enough resources for being who we are and what we can become." I use this quote to illustrate that God created us in different ways, and it would be unjust for us to try living our lives in a way that isn't natural to us. If we look at the words natural and unnatural, the words phison and paraphison are actually the Greek words, phison meaning natural and paraphison meaning unnatural. And we actually see that the word unnatural is used in a few different places throughout the Bible, and it's used in a way that's actually morally correct. In Romans 11:24, Paul describes how God prunes the Gentiles from a wild tree and grafts them onto the cultivated olive tree of God's people. This kind of graft is contrary to nature, but is not a bad thing. The moral valence of paraphison or unnatural depends on its effects. In Romans 1, it is part of a nation turning aside from God and doing what is not natural for them to do. Whereas in Romans 11, it is part of God's plan itself. Paul's use of terms like natural, unnatural, and shameful in describing same sex relations does not necessarily imply that all such relationships are sinful. In 1 Corinthians 11, he similarly labels long hair on men as unnatural, yet this is widely interpreted as reflecting first century customs rather than a universal Christian rule. The Bible itself shows that long hair in men, as in the Nazirite vow, can be honorable. Samson's decision to cut his hair was shameful in his context, while his long hair was actually a source of strength. What is honorable and shameful varies across time, cultures, and contexts. Okay, so I wanted to include this so you can see that even though the word unnatural is used to describe these relationships, A, we don't really have a solid understanding of what unnatural means. And B, unnatural is often used in the Bible for things that actually can be good. And so that's important to remember. Additionally, it's important to remember that these verses don't exist in isolation, and everything that comes before and after also have an impact on the words themselves. So what we see is that before these verses, God is describing a people who, in verse 21, they didn't glorify him. They weren't thankful. They became vain in their imaginations. Their hearts were darkened. And then it goes on and talks about all these other things that happened to these people. They were caught up in idolatry. In 24, God gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their hearts. They changed the truth of God into a lie. And then verse 26 says, "For this cause, they reached this point." That phrase, "for this cause," is important because Paul isn't preaching that homosexuality is a sin. Instead, he's teaching that some form of homosexual behavior is a consequence of sin. Whatever behavior Paul is writing about is not a symptom, whatever Paul is writing about is a symptom and not the cause. Basically, Paul is saying that the Romans turned from God and therefore God gave them over to sexual immorality. And that's almost like a parent telling a child, if you don't wear your jacket, you'll get a cold. Getting a cold obviously isn't desirable, but it's not the sin. The real sin is not wearing a coat. So sexual immorality here is a consequence and not the sin itself. If we believe that these verses are being used to condemn homosexuality, that doesn't take into account that these verses are describing a people who turned away from God and they had all of these consequences. And whatever is happening here is a consequence and not the source of the condemnation. Additionally, in these verses, we see that arson is the word that is used here, which is a Greek word for male, instead of the word aner, which is a Greek word meaning adult men. And so, since many other forms of male-male sexual behavior were already frowned upon in contemporary Roman society, surely what Paul had in mind was not what the Romans disdained, but what they approved of, pederasty. At the time Paul wrote this verse, males having sex with males predominantly meant adult men having sex with young adolescent males, or most likely like a pedophilia. So you have an older man having sex with a young boy. Philo the philosopher describes pederasty as males with males. And so when Paul uses that same verbiage, it seems like there's some kind of connection there. Roman culture encouraged male homosexual behavior, but only when free adult men were dominant. Adult free males could penetrate slaves of any gender, and men could penetrate women. Men could also penetrate men from lower classes without penalty. So in this time, it was natural for men to have relationships, same-sex relationships with each other, but it would be unnatural if you had a man from a high class having sex with a man from a low class. That would be considered unnatural. And regardless of that, it seems like most likely what is being condemned here is an older man having sex with a young boy. So it is not the orientation that is condemned, but the actions driven by unrestrained lust concerning idol worship. Paul's argument suggests that heterosexual individuals engaged in homosexual acts as a form of idolatrous worship. In this view, the unnatural acts Paul describes are not about committed loving relationships, but are driven at lust-driven behaviors such as orgies, castration, and male-male degrading prostitution in pagan temples. If we look at this verse again, for God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust one toward another. We understand everything that we've talked about. It seems that these verses are written, and because the people turned away from God, they engaged in sinful behavior that was not natural to them, likely pederasty or sexual idolatry. And nowhere in this verse does it comment on loving, committed same-sex relationships between two people who are faithful and honor God. We're going to take a pause here and jump in with our next section talking about the rest of the verses that discuss homosexuality. But I hope that this has been helpful so far, and I'll see you in the next video.